right, and he goes to a cancer ward. Then you get Sophie, who's been thrust into probably prominence in public life right now, having been really much in the background now for the best part of 25 years, right? And she's thinking about other people. She's thinking about women who are being raped by Russian soldiers as part of the Russian war effort, right? And she stands up for it. She goes out to Ukraine, which is actually not an easy thing to do, I would have thought. And then finally, Meghan is announced that instead of coming to the UK, perhaps to rally round the royal family in difficult times, both with the king and his daughter-in-law. And what does she do? She nips over to Nigeria, basically giving in my view, after all, she keeps the title, doesn't she? She keeps the title, right? Rather than coming back to the UK, she gives a V sign to the people, right? So she likes the title, but she doesn't like the country. Why doesn't she just say so?
I agree. She does have certain issues with Britain, and with people like you spouting off, can you blame her?
I do blame her. Yeah, I do blame her.
And actually, you could have summed it up.
Are you telling me that it was right for her to say, yes, goodbye, thank you, 6,000 miles away? Sorry, you carry on. Sorry.
What's fascinating is the long diatribe, a spiel on the good works, commendable works by the King.
It's got your, that's got a stamp of approval,
100%.
has it? Oh,
I wish we'd give more attention to Ukraine. That is where the trouble lies. We all turn a blind eye, but when Sophie rocks up in a frock, briefly, Ukraine reappears on the agenda.
That is ridiculous. But the Ukraine war is not being covered by the media.
Let's be honest. Let's be honest.
Ludicrous. Write this down.
What Putin wants, Putin pretty much gets at the moment, and that's the truth. We can come on to that. The GPS blocking, etc., you name it, he's at it. But I commend Sophie's visit, and you said, oh, she's not been doing this. You're quite wrong. She's visited Iraq, she's visited Kosovo, the Republic of Congo, she's visited Germany, Afghanistan.
That wasn't my point.
But
my point
is
was that she has not had the publicity that other members of the royal family have, and she stepped forward because of what's happened to Kate.
What distressed me is that you compared them, working members of the royal family, funded the trip to Ukraine by the Foreign Office, quite rightly so, representing us on behalf of the King.
Good.
The King, likewise, protected, part of the institution, doing what he passionately wants to do, his vocation. And then you compare them with the Duchess of Sussex as a private individual who, incidentally, will give people in Nigeria a huge amount of pleasure by visiting them. And the real reason your nose is put out of joint is that she's not coming to Britain.
How do you know
that Meghan
going to Nigeria is going to give them a huge amount of pleasure? You're guessing at it, aren't you? Everywhere else she's gone, she gets a huge raspberry. She comes over here, the most loved person I can ever remember joining the royal family, and within half an hour, she said, I'm not hanging around being told what to do by you lot, and she heads out to LA in the mansion. Honestly, she's not worth defending.
Just as we know that shared experience, the King gave pleasure, Sophie will have given pleasure in Ukraine, desperately needed, and likewise shared experience, Meghan, with her super stardust, which is why people like you are so peeved, because she turned her back on Britain. I understand we can sort out some counselling for you, Kelvin.
I'm peeved about her
You will
actions.
recover from this. You will recover from this.
Why doesn't she come back to the UK and wave to us all?
Because she thinks people like Kelvin McKenzie are going to be
Well, I'm entitled to a view.
That's true, though,
and so
isn't it,
are
Jacob?
you. You're entitled to a view, but that shouldn't stop her coming out and giving her views to our country.
All right. Well, I think let's move on to something less contentious.
Where are you on this,
because
Jacob?
a trade union representing senior civil servants has submitted an application for a judicial review against the government's controversial plan to send migrants to Rwanda. The FDA said its move related to the relationship of the Civil Service Code to the Government Safety of Rwanda Act. It claims the Rwanda scheme forces civil servants to ignore international law, which would breach the Civil Service Code to uphold the rule of law and administration of justice. Well, I hope my panel has calmed down in the last 30 seconds. I shall return to them. Tessa, the Civil Service Union seems to want to ignore a law that's just been passed, saying that Rwanda is a safe country.
This morning, I went down to make my oat milk decaffeinated coffee, and I switched on Radio 4's Today programme. And I rarely am, because one becomes inured to bad news and sad stories. But to hear that Iraqi man who lost his 7-year-old daughter, who'd been seeking asylum and been rejected 14 times, who couldn't get safe passage, whose child died of suffocation on a dinghy while the French police hopelessly looked on and Britain once more bangs on about Rwanda. And I found tears splashing down my cheeks. And I actually think this is thin end of the wedge stuff, Jacob. We need to look at Rwanda. We need to revisit where it places us and our record on human rights. And actually, I believe that many civil servants who believed when they went into their job and they did those very difficult tests post-university believed that they would be putting pen and ink and effort to forwarding the agenda of a fundamentally decent country, and that is what the act of Rwanda upturns for them. It makes us nasty.
That story, which I also heard, was desperately tragic.
Yes.
But isn't the conclusion that you have to stop the people traffickers, that those are the
Where's the safe passage,
those are the ones who are responsible. They're the ones who allowed this little girl, 7-year-old girl, to die because they overloaded the boat. They took money from these people and they had no duty of care. And that if we stop people coming on the boats, then we save lives. And to do that, you have to do things that make the lives of the people traffickers
It is
harder.
bonkers, it's blue cheese bonkers to suggest that the possible spectre of Rwanda, because very few people are going to go, even people who believe in the act don't think it's more of a symbolic deterrent than a real deterrent. If you think that that will stop people who are so desperate they take their 7-year-olds on dinghies into the deep, dark blue sea.
Because they thought they'd get to the United Kingdom.
Yes, and that's what they'll keep on thinking.
The only reason that family, as you carefully edited what you heard this morning, because I heard it as well, was that the family had been kicked out of Sweden, where they'd spent 3 years.
Yes, they've been seeking asylum for 14 years. His daughter was born in Europe.
So, you know, in a sense, the argument, if you're going to have an argument about this, is not about connecting with us. It's to say, well, why haven't the Swedes, who've got tundra coming out of their ears, right? We are a small nation with 70 million people in there. They are a larger nation with about 8 million people.
Kelvin, do you know where that man came from? Do you know where he came from?
He came from Iraq.
He came from Basra. Now, who occupied Basra? Who wellied on in there without being invited?
So,
the British military
are
did.
you in favour of open frontiers? Are you in favour of allowing everybody into our country,
I would argue,
even people that have been kicked out of other people's countries?
The thing is,
he was being hounded by a militia that came into existence in the wake of Saddam Hussein, and we have a direct.
They all say they will be hounded out. They all say they're gay. They all say they're this, right? And they all throw their documents into the water to make sure that we can't find out who they are.
He didn't throw his documents away.
His applications had been turned down 14 times. That doesn't
Did we apply to go into Iraq when we went into Basra
that doesn't imply
in 2003?
that his grounds for claiming asylum were valid. So unless you're in favour of open borders, then...
I'm not in favour of exclusively open borders, but we need to look at safe passage. We need to look at safe passage, and we need to understand
Surely we need to stop
Rwanda,
the people traffickers. That must be the priority.
Yes, I agree.
And Rwanda is part of that.
And safe passage is part of that, and speeding up the process. And actually, the result of
We've had
Rwanda...
safe routes. We've taken many people from Ukraine, many people from Hong Kong. We've taken many people from Syria. David Cameron had a plan for 20,000 to come.
Yeah, but no longer from Syria.
No longer, that's true. We took many from Afghanistan as well.
Very difficult.
We create these safe routes under certain circumstances. But unless you're in favour of open borders, we need a scheme of deterrence. And Rwanda already seems to be working.
If you look at the numbers of people who die in the Channel, including 7-year-old children, if that isn't a deterrent...
But that's why we've got to stop it.
But it's ridiculous to suggest, if I say to you, statistically, there is a 10% chance you're going to die in the Channel, but guess what? There's a 1% chance of going to Rwanda.
But it's not,
you think Rwanda will stop them and the Channel won't.
chance of dying.
What's the percentage chance of dying in the Channel?
It'd be like 0.001.
And which is the chance of going to Rwanda, statistically, in this current Conservative administration?
They might be the same, actually.
Yes, thank you. Did you hear that?
Yeah, that's very unlikely. They'll be much higher for going to Rwanda.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you to my panel. Coming up next, we'll be discussing the report that may have just debunked the masochistic claim that Britain's wealth was built on slavery.
I'm Martin Daubney. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
SUV drivers in Oxford will face higher parking charges. Proposals tabled by the local Green Party or passed by the City Council. The motion argues that heavier cars like SUVs cause more damage to roads, are more likely to seriously injure or kill pedestrians, and cause more illnesses due to pollution. However, the Alliance of British Drivers has condemned the plan as absolutely outrageous. Well, let's get the thoughts now of the legendary motoring journalist, Quentin Wilson. Quentin, welcome to the show. Always a pleasure. We hear a lot about the war on motorists, this time targeting SUVs because of their weight, and the charges could be astronomical. This idea first started in Paris. Now it's coming to Oxford. Can you tell us a bit about how it would work?
OK, so the idea is that the charges will penalise people who drive heavier SUVs, and I guess by implication electric cars, although Oxford Council haven't said exactly what they're going to do with EVs. But this is all based around this notion of SUVs being heavier than passenger cars, therefore wearing out the roads more. Now, there was a study, I've got it here in front of me, from the University of Edinburgh in 2022 that said real-world tests found that overwhelmingly the wear is caused by large vehicles, buses, heavy good vehicles. Road wear from cars and motorcycles is so low that this is immaterial. Now, obviously, driving around a medieval city like Oxford in an SUV isn't the brightest thing in the world to do. But the idea that we should penalise the owners of these cars based on imperfect science that's been read on social media, I think is completely wrong.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry. Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Well, welcome back. The mail mogs have been flowing in as always. Anna says Meghan and Harry are a tragic case who represent our troubled younger generation who cry, woe is me at every turn, ignoring what generations went through before them. And Adam, I think your point's absolutely beautiful, actually. If cancer thinks it can beat our king, it should think again. He's far too full of goodness. What a delightful point. And Glenn, what's the problem with the civil service suing the government over Rwanda? Conscientious objectors. No, the problem is it's an attempt to delay the plan. It's a further effort by the left to stop the government getting on with the business of governing when the law has been passed. I hope they do not succeed. Earlier this month, the Business Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, told a conference in the city that it's wrong to attribute Britain's wealth to slavery and colonialism and seemingly upset all the right people. Former historian turned left-wing activist William Dalrymple claimed the Secretary of State ought to, quote, learn some history in what is seemingly the historical equivalent of eco-fanatics saying follow the science. But a new report published by the Distinguished Institute of Economic Affairs has suggested that colonial profits funded 7 to 15% of investment in Britain and that sugar produced by slaves boosted the economy by only 2.5%. The author of the report, Christian Nimitz, goes on to argue that while colonialism and slavery made some people very rich, such profits were not large enough seriously to affect macroeconomic aggregates like Britain's investment rate and capital formation. Well, one of his colleagues, the communications officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Harrison Griffiths, joins me. Now, Harrison, thank you for coming in. 7 to 15% of investment sounds like quite a lot.
Yeah, it certainly does. And the higher end of that range, it rests on a pretty implausible calculation of the savings rate that British colonists would have had to have kind of employed in order to in order for colonial profits to have generated that much of Britain's investment wealth. So if we project that they had a roughly similar savings rate to the one that domestic British consumers had, then it's probably closer to that 7% range. Now, that does sound like a lot. That's certainly nothing to be sniffed at, but you have to then compare it against the costs. And then the costs that come out are, for example, the costs of creating and maintaining a colonial empire, which are significant. If Britain had, for example, cut its military expenditure down to French or German levels at the time, we could have had a tax cut that would have been worth about a quarter of the overall tax burden.
What time are we talking about? Is this 18th century that we're talking about? Yes,
so this is the, as the age of empire really ramps up. So this is the late 18th and early to mid-19th centuries, just before the Industrial Revolution really kicks off in earnest.
OK, and so the agricultural revolution is taking place and sugar is being created by the slaves or grown by the slaves and brought back to England. That's the main source of revenue, because sugar isn't just sold in the UK, it's sold to other countries.
Yes, so when we're talking about slavery, sugar is kind of the highest earner, so to speak. But what you kind of...
Sorry to interrupt, but what about the trade itself? Because obviously we are instrumental in the trade in people at the earlier stages of this. Is that profitable for the UK?
It's not profitable for the UK, broadly speaking. The controversy is not whether this generates some money for some people. It's certainly made a lot of people very rich. We can't get away from that. But what it is a product of government protectionism, basically. The government, through its military expenditure and in some cases literally direct fiscal transfers, is subsidising and protecting these people to exchange in people. And so what you have there is what you have whenever you have a government intervention. It creates concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. And those dispersed costs were borne by British taxpayers, British consumers, and of course the people who were the victims of the trade.
So in the 18th and 19th centuries, the UK is a very fast growing economy. It does extremely well, and also at the beginning of the 18th century at least, it's a very important slave trading nation. Is it not fair to say that there is a correlation between the two?
No, not exactly, because if you look at the analysis, the people who got rich were a concentrated group of politically well-connected individuals. And you see this with government interventions all the time. I think housing in the present day is a good example. You have a small group of people who benefit from the government's restrictive planning laws. Because they're a small group of people, and partly because of the electoral system, it's very much easier for them to politically organise than everybody else. So through restrictive planning laws, you have a tremendous act, in my opinion, of national economic self-harm, but it does benefit a small group of people, which is why it continues. It's exactly the same story when it comes to colonialism and trade.
And what about the later costs of removing the slave trade that come in the second half of the 19th century, when the British Navy, the Royal Navy, is spending a lot of its time and effort on trying to stop slavery?
Yes, so when the process of Britain outlawing slavery in its colonies kind of goes from 1834 to 1843, and in 1837 an act is passed to basically buy off people who previously owned slaves. This may seem like a kind of tragic decision from a moral perspective, but from a pragmatic perspective, they knew it would be much easier to secure the emancipation of slaves if they paid people off. So it starts with that. And then there was a rather significant military operation by the Royal Navy for some decades to eradicate the slave trade on the trade routes and colonies that it controlled. These were significant expenditures. The expenditure alone to basically pay off slave owners to free their slaves was at the time about 40% of the Exchequer's total revenue. These were serious payments. Now, I would argue, even as a pretty libertarian guy, that these were good government expenditures to basically end the scourge of slavery. But they're still costs nonetheless that we have to account for in this legacy.
And it continues, because if you go through to Gordon, why is Gordon at Khartoum? Gordon is at Khartoum because he's trying to put down the slave trade, and then you have the relief expedition of Kitchener that is enormously expensive. Admittedly, the Sudan ends up being incorporated into the empire, but that was all about stopping slavery, or that was its origination.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is where you look at these figures, like 7% of total investment. You might say, that is quite a lot of money. I mean, British financial services at the moment, one of our biggest, most important industries, accounts for about 8.3% of our total annual investment. But it has to be compared against those costs. And some of those costs you've just described of ending slavery are a product of the fact that we employed it in the first place. And there were also costs of defending, establishing empire and slavery in the first place.
So the 7% investment, or 7 to 15%, you explained why I think it's the lower figure, is annual investment coming in.
It's long-run average. Yeah.
And the 2.5% figure of economic growth, is that an annual average or is that a cumulative average figure?
So it's a long-term average figure.
Long-term average.
So,
but what else
when you're looking at that, you're looking at a smaller portion over that same time period of sheep farming in the UK. Nobody says that sheep farming triggered the Industrial Revolution, and yet you have this pervasive myth that slavery did.
So what is it about the beginnings of the 18th century that forms the basis of the 19th century Industrial Revolution and the extraordinary development of the UK, which then spreads around the world?
So unsatisfactory as it might be, there are lots and lots of different competing hypotheses about this. But economists generally say, broadly speaking, it's to do with the institutions that a country has. Now, that's very vague, I know, but that's things like private property rights, for example, the rule of law, liberal democracy, generally speaking, which generates the conditions necessary for free markets to emerge. And then ultimately, Britain is actually a very successful free trading nation without colonies, right? So most of our foreign trade is undertaken with the United States and with other European countries. And so that combination of domestic free markets and free trade with our neighbours, as well as some trade with the colonies, created the conditions, basically high wages in the UK for massive capital investment that triggered the Industrial Revolution.
So it's basically what Sir John Fortescue predicted when he wrote in 1485. Thank you very much, Harrison. And finally, last year I asked artificial intelligence to show me a picture of what Andrew Bailey would look like if he identified as a good governor of the Bank of England. And it showed me this picture. Yes, how we all miss the days of Mervyn King's governorship of the bank, long before the flock of ostriches took over and immersed their heads in the sand. But while he's been missed as governor, the good news is that he's taking over an even more distinguished institution. He's been appointed the new president of the Marylebone Cricket Club, which must make him the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Anyway, that's all from me. Up next, it's Patrick Christie's. Patrick, have you got Lords of Lords and King of Kings on your programme this evening?
No, but I've got loads and loads of great stuff, Jacob. I'm starting to have a chat about the number of migrant sex offenders that we have in this country and why they are not being revealed to us by the authorities. AstraZeneca has finally admitted that there are, in cases, vaccine damages. I'm going to be talking to some survivors there. The Harry Potter actors are continuing to absolutely slam J.K. Rowling, despite the fact they'd be stacking shelves in Lidl if it wasn't for that particular franchise. Visas for foreign students, they've stopped them bringing dependents over, and shock horror, they've reduced. I've got all that and much more, Jacob.
Well, it's a real success, and you'd have seen in the House of Commons earlier today a statement being made about how the numbers of legal migrants are coming down, which is much easier to do than illegal.
Yes, no, indeed, and I just feel as though the tide is slightly turning. Maybe for Rishi Sunak, but a long way to go there.
OK, that's all off the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been Save the Nation, and the weather in Somerset will be fantabulous as always, and you'll be singing hallelujahs to the sunshine that you get there tomorrow.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hi there, welcome to the latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Heavy rain overnight in the south, continuing into much of Thursday. Risk of thunderstorms in places, but it will be much drier further north. We've got an area of low pressure across the continent. That's going to push some humid and warm air into much of the UK overnight, but on the boundary between that and the cooler air out in the Atlantic, we've got this reactivation of a frontal zone bringing some heavy rain to Northern Ireland, Wales, and then increasingly southern England. The persistent wet weather will affect South Wales and the southwest of England by dawn, but thundery showers will turn up across the Midlands, southern England as well, and they'll tend to drift their way northwards and westwards into mid-Wales and continue for some time through the morning. Eventually the rain does ease in many places. We keep the cloud cover in the south, but much drier and brighter weather is expected further north. I think for northern England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, some decent sunny spells will turn up. However, on the North Sea coast, a lot of low cloud will be prevalent, and that will limit temperatures 11 to 12 Celsius, whilst it goes up to 21 to 23 Celsius in western Scotland. Similar temperature contrast across northern Scotland. On Friday, warm in the west, cool in the east. Southern England, some warm sunshine as well, but in between, outbreaks of rain continuing, even some thundery showers. On Saturday, the fine weather moves north, but there'll be further rain coming up from the south.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
You really could be our next big winner with an incredible £20,000 in tax-free cash to play with this summer. What would you spend that on? Well, whilst you're thinking about it, listen to some of our previous winners getting that winning phone call from us.
You're the winner of the Great British Giveaway.
I'm slipping neck. Oh dear.
Oh my God, are you joking?
You're joking. Really? Seriously, it's not a wine. What is it?
Oh my God, this is amazing. Thank you.
The next winning call could be answered by you. For a chance to win £20,000 in tax-free cash, text WIN to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB05 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 31st of May. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
GB News is Britain's election channel. And from tomorrow,
The people decide.
as the country heads to the polls in a rush of elections, we'll take you through the night as the first results come in.
And we'll pick up at breakfast
with the very best guests and analysis.
And on the weekend, the results won't stop, and neither will we.
We'll explore what it all means for you as we look ahead to the general election.
Continuing coverage live from tomorrow at midnight on GB News. 2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio, and online.
This is GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.